السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. ما الذي قد يدفع هذا الكاثوليكية الاميركية من أصول إيرلندية وإيطالية إلى أن يكون أحد الأصوات العالمية الرائدة في المجاهرة بالإعجاب بنبي الاسلام محمد صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وسلم في ظل كل التحديات الآنية ومأسسة الإسلاموفوبيا وتفشي العنصرية بشكل فاقع وخطير تصاعديا في الغرب؟ لعل كتاب إنسانية محمد لعالم الاجتماع البارز الأستاذ كريج كونسيداين يقدم هذه النظرة العامة لحياة الرسول ولإرثه، إضافة إلى تحليل اجتماعي لتعاليم النبي ونموذجه، ولعله يوضح كيف اعتنق محمد مبدأ التعددية الدينية، وكيف كان تصوره للأمة المدنية والتعايش، وكيف عبر عن مناهضة العنصرية ودافع عن طلب المعرفة وبادر إلى الدفاع عن حقوق المرأة واتباع القاعدة الذهبية، أي المعاملة بالمثل، وهو مبدأ أخلاقي يدعو الناس إلى معاملة الآخرين بالطريقة التي يريدون أن يعاملوا بها. الأستاذ كونسيداين في كتابه يلقي الضوء على جانب من جوانب النبي الذي غالبا ما ينسى ذكره في الروايات والمقاربات الإعلامية السائدة. للتطرق أكثر إلى فحوى هذا الكتاب ومضمونه، يطيب لنا أن نستقبل من هيوستن تكساس دكتور كريج كونسيداين، أستاذ علم الاجتماع في جامعة رايس ومؤلف العديد من الكتب عن العلاقات الإسلامية المسيحية في أمريكا وسواها من المقالات والدراسات. أهلا بكم إلى هذه الحلقة من برنامج من الداخل عبر الميادين. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Craig Considine, professor of sociology at Rice University in Houston, Texas, author of The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View, and Islam in America, exploring the issues, among other books, which focus on the Christian-Muslim dialogue. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the inside, sir.
Peace be with you, Zainab. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. True pleasure to have you, sir. Well, Dr. Craig, it's quite interesting that although you grew up in what you refer to as a 99% Christian and white town in Boston, Massachusetts, yet you have developed the sense of or inclination to research and study thoroughly Islam and the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace be upon him. Also to focus on the Islamic tradition and Christian-Muslim relations. How did you develop this interest, and was it only out of curiosity or something else compelled you to pursue such studies?
Well, that's a really good question. And, I think to start with, I must say that I'm a product of the 9/11 generation in the United States. As you mentioned, Zainab, where I grew up in Boston, I grew up in a town 99% white, 99% Christian. And when 9/11 happened, I had absolutely no context whatsoever to make sense of the events. And I also had no knowledge of the things that were being thrown at me and a lot of Americans in the media about Islam, about the Islamic tradition, and about Prophet Muhammad. So I was curious when I went into college to figure out why something like 9/11 actually happened. And when I got to college, I was really blessed, honestly, to have some amazing teachers who happened to be Muslim, who really introduced me to the richness of Islam, to the life of Prophet Muhammad. And the more I listened to my teachers, who were really my role models and my guides, the more I realized how much the Islamic tradition and Prophet Muhammad, peace be with him, his life and legacy had to teach us in the 21st century. So a lot of the things that we see around us, religious intolerance, racism, this idea of the clash of civilizations, when I read about Muhammad, I realized that he was offering a different idea of what it meant to be a human being and what it meant to share this earth regardless of faith. So for me, it was really about knowledge, this idea of understanding current events and understanding it not only through the prism of studying and books, which is obviously really important, but through people, Zainab. You know, I've been really lucky, again, to know and to befriend Muslims who are like brothers and sisters to me.
Right.
And the more I got to know these people, the more I fell in love with the tradition.
Right. Now, Dr. Craig, that said, what did the studying and researching of the Prophet Muhammad teach you about Islam?
Well, so much.
So much.
I think, yeah, so much. I mean, when I first started, it was really about the Abrahamic tradition. You know, Muhammad, when he came in the 6th century, he was not necessarily introducing a new religion. I think a lot of Muslims would agree with that. And my teachers would emphasize that Islam was part of the tradition that I'm a part of as a Christian. And obviously, Christianity is a derivative of Judaism. So it started off with this idea of monotheism, this idea of justice, of charity, of just goodwill and human rights. And then when I really got into studying it, largely around 2010, you know, Islamophobia was at its height in my country, in the United States. And you have these groups like, you know, Al-Qaeda and ISIS doing all of these things. And when I'm reading about the life of Muhammad,
in the name of Islam.
In the name of Islam, and it's exactly the opposite of what he was teaching. And then you have other people on the realm of kind of anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia having all of these ideas about what Islam was and what Muhammad was. And I had all this knowledge, and I said, here, you know, here's this knowledge. I mean, he's talking about Christians and Jews being al-Kitab, people of the book. All of the stories that we know that are documented in Islamic sources, authentic sources, saying that, you know, Muhammad welcomed Christians, you know, the hospitality that he gave to Christians as well. So part of my kind of efforts here is not only to, you know, shed a hopeful and promising light on Islam, but it's really to try to introduce Islam and Muhammad to Christians that may have these views of him that I think are incorrect.
Right. Now, allow me to ask you, Craig, as far as we know, you are a devoted Christian, a Catholic. So what is Islam in the eyes of a still devoted Christian today, despite all this hype that you talked about of Islamophobia and racist polemics and tirades? And how is the Islamic tradition interrelated, interconnected to the Christian one?
Well, as I mentioned, you know, Islam is not necessarily a new faith, and I think most Muslim scholars would agree with that. And for me, you know, when I look at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, I do not see three different religions. I essentially see three branches of the same tree. And that tree is rooted in Abraham, Prophet Abraham, and that tree is God in its monotheism. And I think that's really important for people to understand. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people have kind of missed this point that, you know, we believe in the same God. We may have little differences here and there over theology, but I think it's also important to recognize, Zainab, like even something like the divinity of Jesus, which, you know, as a Christian, that is something that I grew up informed on. You know, they were telling us that Jesus is this and that. But if you actually go into history, there's a lot of debate, even amongst Christians, about who Jesus is and what he came to do. And the more I study this tradition and the more I look at what Prophet Muhammad was saying about Jesus, I kind of see common ground, potential common ground there. So it's almost looking at it like, Zainab, it's like we're cousins. We're all part of the same family.
Sure, the common denominators are much, much more than any kind of nuances or differences or discrepancies between the celestial religions and faiths. In your book, Dr. Craig, The Humanity of Muhammad, you shed light on the side of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that is often forgotten in the mainstream depictions and media narratives. Tell us more, please.
Right. So in the mainstream media depictions, at least in the country of my birth, the United States, we hear things about, jihad and Sharia and a lot of these buzzwords that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. And I really don't focus too much on those things necessarily. I focus on the example that Muhammad had provided to his followers and to future generations. And when I look at his life and legacy, I try to make sense of it in terms of what's happening around us today. So when I started really writing about it in my books, as I mentioned earlier, ISIS was doing all of these things in the name of Islam, and we saw the persecution of Christian communities around Iraq and Syria and so on and so forth. And then when I looked at the legacy of Muhammad, he wasn't, Zainab, just tolerating Christians. That's a very basic understanding of what he was doing. Mm-hmm. He was actually engaging in what I call religious pluralism, mm-hmm. which is the energetic engagement with religious diversity. And mm-hmm. I used in the book the example of around 630, the year 630, he invited the Christians of Najran mm-hmm. To Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina. And he let them into the mosque and they had a dialogue. But even more importantly than that, he actually allowed them to pray in his mosque. Mm-hmm. And when I learned about that example, and then I look and juxtapose that to what ISIS was doing, I said, this is absurd what they're doing. Another thing, what we're seeing in the United States right now with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of this discussion about racial inequality and racism, mm-hmm. Prophet Muhammad, generations ago was right. He was not only telling his followers not to be racist, mm-hmm. he was telling them to be anti-racist.
Anti-racist, true. Allow us, Dr. Craig, to stop now for a short break, and then we will focus after the break more on Islam and this kind of misinformation, but after the break. إذن فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد. Dr. Craig Considine, Professor of Sociology at Rice University. Welcome back, sir. Now, Craig, how come you did not go down the path of misinformation? You told us about your background. We know that you come from Massachusetts, Boston. How come you didn't go down this path of taking the bait of the news that depicts both Islam, the Quran, and the Holy Prophet, sometimes in a twisted, rudimentary manner?
That's a really good question, Zainab. And, when I think about this and I reflect upon it, I really don't think it was in my hands. I think it was in God's hands because, as I mentioned earlier, I had amazing teachers. Mm-hmm. And I chose the classes that I chose when I first went to college and the light bulb went off in my head. But I was really thankful to have good leaders, which the world is really lacking today. I often wonder if I had gone into that classroom and that teacher had anti-Muslim views, I could have easily gone down that road. Mm-hmm. But I had a really good teacher who was a man of faith, who was a man that loved me regardless of my faith. His name was Akbar Ahmed, Professor Akbar Ahmed of American University. And I trusted him and I let him guide me. Mm-hmm. So I honestly think it was not in my control. It was really part of my destiny as a human being, and I had faith in what I was doing, and I had faith in my teachers.
Right. Well, of course, some of your detractors or voices that criticize your approach and your continuous affirmation of the love you have for Islam and the Prophet of Islam are provoking others against you and posing a big question, which is how much damage does your flagrant misinformation about Islam do? Definitely, it is also driven by your stance regarding the Palestinian cause. So how do you react to such voices, Craig?
To be honest, Zainab, I don't really let them get in between my ears, and I don't let them get in my head or my heart. I have faith in this mission that I'm on, And I'll give you an example. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, a popular scholar here in the United States, I had the privilege of meeting him once, and he told me there's two ways of dealing with detractors. You can think horizontally. Horizontally thinking is like you are concerned about what's happening here on this earth and you care about the gossip and the people who are calling you names, or you think vertically and you answer to God, and he is your ultimate judge. So I really ignore the noise, and I put my faith in God. I place my faith in him, and I think that he's using me to build bridges between Christians and Muslims.
But don't you try to form a kind of rebuttal of what they are trying to say when it comes to the issue of Islam and the Prophet?
I do, and I don't use emotion when I do it. I don't call people names because that's counterproductive.
Sure.
I battle it with knowledge. Right. So if someone comes at me and says, well, you know, Muhammad treated Christians this way, then you provide a different example. So I think all of us need to focus a bit more on the power of knowledge and the ability of education and stories and examples that we have through our religious and secular sources. These are really powerful, and they can do a lot of goodwill in terms of building these bridges.
Right. Now, can the power of prayer alone stop a pandemic like the coronavirus? Even the Prophet Muhammad thought otherwise. This was your opinion piece in the Newsweek, which has invited a wide swathe of attention. Tell us more about the reaction of the international media and how they featured Prophet Muhammad's teachings to fight coronavirus.
Right. So the Newsweek article that I wrote, it's actually really funny. I wrote it in 15 minutes because Prophet Muhammad's examples and his teachings were so straightforward. It doesn't really invite a lot of analysis. He said, be clean. Cleanliness is part of faith. If there is a plague in a certain community, don't go into that certain community. And if you're in that community, don't leave it because you can spread it. So these are very basic issues. But the main story that I think really caught the international media's attention is an authentic story related to him. And he was traveling with a Bedouin man, and Muhammad and the Bedouin man were both on their camels.
Tie the camel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And they both get off the camel, and Muhammad says, aren't you going to tie your camel? And the man says, I place my trust in God. And Muhammad said, tie your camel, then place your trust in God. So this is really important. He's saying there's a fine balance between rationality and faith. Be smart. God has made us with intellect. We are rational people. Use that rationality and also have faith. So we must always use these two things in combination with one another.
And we should always take precautionary measures before it's too late. Now, speaking, Craig, about the coronavirus, now Florida, Texas, and Arizona have recently emerged as the country's latest COVID-19 epicenters after reporting record numbers of new infections for weeks in a row. The situation is rather explosive. How are the people coping where you are, Craig, in Texas, in Houston? And how do you believe that a record surge in new cases is the clearest sign yet of the historic failure in the United States to control the virus?
Well, thankfully, things are getting better around here in terms of people taking basic precautions, like wearing a mask. You know, my wife and I, when we used to go out a month or two ago around Texas, I would say I always tried to count the number of people when we would go out shopping, and like 30% of the people would be wearing it. And we were like, this is not good. It's gotten a lot better, which is good. But I think what happened in Memorial Day, which is a holiday that happens at the end of May, the government of Texas ended the kind of lockdown and they allowed things to open up. And I think that's where people really started getting infected again through barbecues, through home events and things like that. In regards to the overall situation here, let me say this, and let me be very clear with this. The federal government needs to take control of this situation. It cannot necessarily leave everything up to the states. Like what happened in Georgia, the governor of Georgia just sued the mayor of Atlanta because the mayor of Atlanta made a mandatory mask ban. I mean, this is just absurd. I mean, we can't even get people to wear masks. So there's really a failure of leadership. Going back to what I was saying at the beginning, the importance of leadership is so important, and it really does start at the top with the president.
Sure. Now, your paper, Craig, the racialization of Islam in the United States, Islamophobia, hate crimes, and flying while brown, explores the intersectionality of race and Islamophobia and experiences of American Muslims and non-Muslims in the US of A, and reveals how racialization processes interact with Islamophobic discourses and actions in American society. To what extent, Craig, is Islamophobia institutionalized in today's US?
Well, I think it's definitely institutionalized. Let me start by first making a comment on the racialization. So what the American people have been fed in terms of what a Muslim is and is not has been a continuation over many, many years. And it's fed through us, through media, through Hollywood, through news, and so on and so forth. And they've created a racial archetype of what a Muslim looks like, which is someone who is brown, they may wear a beard. And what's happened, and I document this in the paper, is that even non-Muslims, so Hindus and Sikhs, have fallen victims to hate crimes in the United States because perpetrators, people who actually are carrying out these hate crimes, think they're Muslims. And these people who are carrying out these crimes are fed this information. In terms of the overall institutionalization, I mean, there's been so many examples since 9/11 that we have, unfortunately, it's gotten better, but the FBI and local authorities in states like New York have carried out surveillance programs on Muslim communities and mosques. They've placed informants in mosques, and they've essentially spied on Muslims. And this is really unfortunate. And then we also have
to add to this, excuse me, Dr. Craig, to add to this, even the media, even the drama, even Netflix, they try to institutionalize Islamophobic incidents through the scenarios, through writing that, terrorism emanates from the mosques.
Yeah, and it's just completely unfortunate. And we've had major television programs like 24, which a lot of Americans watched. And, a lot of Americans have been brainwashed into thinking that there's a direct connection between this term Muslim and terrorism, as if only Muslims can carry out terrorism. And actually, and I've written about this in one of my previous books, Muslims in America Examining the Facts, most terrorist incidences that are carried out in this country are carried out by white supremacists. And actually the US government, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security has actually said, yes, that is true. Muslims do not commit, not even close to the amount of terrorist acts that white supremacists do in this country. So the Islamophobia is deeply rooted, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. And I have lots and lots of other questions, but time has run short. From Houston, Texas, Dr. Craig Kounsoudian, professor at the Department of Sociology, Rice University, and author of the good read, The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View. Thank you very much, Craig, for this highly enlightening talk.
Thank you, Zainab. God bless you, and take care.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure speaking to you too. Bless your heart and be safe. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. لتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا من كل فريق عمل برنامج من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.